Oh, there you go. That's it. All right, I'm back. Whew, I hit the wrong button. Whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I'm still trying to broadcast us.
Let me do this a little bit so you can see that you can see it, so that's
just a reminder. I'm not sure if you'll need to hit record.
Yes.
Oh, yes. We don't all have to record though, just you.
Right.
Okay. Is that too much glare in the background?
Okay, so Tim, are you seeing any broadcast live?
Yes.
Okay.
I see a little marker that says that. I don't see anything regarding recording.
No, I got the live up in the corner too.
I have my tablet going, but I don't see a live stream on here.
Well, on mine it says live up in the left corner.
Oh, here we go. Okay, so live now.
Okay.
All right. So we've got, let's see.
I think we have everybody.
Yeah, I have someone looking to sign in, Lizette Pacheco. Oh, I'm assuming that Vice Chair Pacheco. I'm going to go ahead and admit. And as soon as he joins us, I'm going to go ahead and hit the record. We are live streaming.
Okay. And remind me if I start just shaking my head that you can talk. It's all right.
Yeah, if we could just get everybody to do a quick sound check.
Yeah, okay.
Alvin?
Yeah, but I'm here.
Okay. Aida, I don't see your image.
I'm off to the corner to do safe distancing.
Okay.
Let me just see if I can do this.
Yeah, if you can.
Are you in there now, man?
No, that's
okay. What I'll do is I know what I'll go like right here too. There we go. Okay.
Okay, so I can hear Alvin, Aida. Ivan, you're on mute.
Radio check?
Yes, there you go. Marvin?
I'm here.
All right, great. And then Richard, I see you. Jerry, you're on mute. Good. And then Tim. And I think we're just waiting for
I don't know why she's not in the picture. She should be.
Yeah.
Jerry, can you test your audio? Can you unmute and test your audio?
Testing.
You're good.
Great, we can hear you. Thanks.
I think we were waiting on Pacheco was coming in.
He's only an electrical guy. I mean, why would he know?
All right, so we are live streaming already. So let me go ahead and hit the record. And if he comes in, if I see his image pop up, I can go ahead and allow him in, and I'll introduce that he's coming on. So are we ready?
I'm ready.
Yeah.
All right. So we're gonna go into record, and you see the image up there, Tim?
Yes,
recording and live on YouTube, correct?
There's a recording.
Okay.
Correct on both. All right, Chair Durham, the meeting is yours.
I'd like to call to order the Planning and Preservation Committee meeting regular notice of March the 11th. I'm sorry, May the 11th. Michelle, would you read the roll, please?
Yes, and for purposes of roll call and any other items that we're going to be voting on, it's going to be a roll call vote. This is a regular, good evening, Chairperson and members of the Commission. This is a regular meeting for the Planning and Preservation Commission, May 11th, 2020. And Chairperson Alvin Durham,
Here.
Vice
Order.
Chair Hector Pacheco, he's absent. Chairperson Ivan Gonzalez,
Here.
Commissioner Aida Montes,
Here,
and Commissioner Marvin Perez.
Here.
Okay, so for the record, the only absent we have at the present time is Vice Chair Pacheco.
Okay, do we want to try to still do the Pledge of Allegiance?
And I guess question for Richard, I don't think we've been doing those
I know we didn't on our other meetings. I
part
did.
of council meetings, is that correct?
Are you talking about the Pledge of Allegiance?
Correct.
Well, I mean, it's strictly speaking, not a requirement of the Brown Act or anything for that matter, but you know, if you so desire.
You can do it if you want. I don't have a problem.
Yeah.
Well, if Chair Durham, if you have a flag somewhere, we'll
They
we'll
got
go.
several flags right here all around me. You can-
They're all over as well.
This is an army officer's house. Come on.
All right, go for it.
okay,
All right. Would you please say the Pledge of Allegiance with me? And I probably should stand.
Yeah.
Hand over your heart, please, and begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And with that, play ball.
I'm gonna take them.
All right, that worked out.
Okay, that works. Okay. And I would take a motion for the approval of the agenda.
I was second that.
We need a first.
Motion to approve, I approve.
Okay, so Ivan is the first and I
And I
is the
approve
second.
also, yeah.
All right, and so the roll call is approval of the agenda for May 11th, 2020. Commissioner Ivan Gonzalez, you moved to approve.
Yes.
Commissioner Aida Montes, you second.
Yes,
Commissioner Marvin Perez, your vote.
I approve.
And Chairperson Durham, your vote.
Yes.
So that is a vote of 4 to approve.
Okay. Next would be then the consent calendar. Do we have a motion to approve the consent calendar?
yes,
Chair Durham, before you get to the consent calendar, I may ask the secretary to just walk through how public statements are being conducted.
Okay.
So as a part of the Planning and Preservation Commission agenda, there was a special notice regarding COVID-19 and the fact that we were going to allow public comments or questions to be submitted electronically by 4 p.m. this afternoon. And agendas went out on Friday. And as of today, as of right now, I haven't received any kind of comments, requests, or concerns.
Good. Okay. So with that said, then we go ahead with the consent calendar. And I would request a motion to approve it.
and I would, approve.
Aida made the motion. Somebody want a second?
I second.
Okay. Michelle?
All right, so Commissioner Montes, you move to approve the Planning and Preservation Commission meeting minutes of March 9th, 2020.
Yes, I do.
Commissioner Gonzalez, you second.
Yes.
Commissioner Perez, your vote.
I agree. Yes.
And and Chairperson Alvin Durham, your vote.
Yes.
Thank you.
And now we need to do the minutes for the March 9th meeting.
Yeah,
That was,
Has everybody had a chance to read them already? They already have them in hand.
What was just approved was the minutes for the March 9th meeting.
But that was, okay, perfect.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
No worries.
I'm trainable, just not very. All right, so we're on to the APA Learn Planning Commission Training Series.
Yes, and if the chair would be willing to entertain, I'd like to actually start with new business and then follow that up with the Planning Commission training series.
Okay.
Since,
That would kind of make sense to me anyway.
Yeah, but it was followed over from our previous meeting, had a continued business item. But I wanted to start just with the discussion about the new business item, city's action regarding the coronavirus. So the last time we all got a chance to get together was March 9th, 2000 of this year. Within hours after that last meeting, pandemonium broke loose globally, certainly here in North America. It was perhaps that it was, right around that time that the World Health Organization had declared a pandemic related to coronavirus, and locally, shutdowns of sort of systematic shutdowns at the state level, at the county, and at the local level, quickly sort of escalated from there. City Hall went to, limited services, social distancing, to ultimately shutting down to the public completely. And there were a couple periods of actually, really a full quarantine from employees as well. So City Hall, city functions remain up and operating. The city functions are really considered essential and critical, even during this time. And so, all the city services have continued on as much as possible uninterrupted. And certainly there are a lot of real critical services that we provide, meals to senior citizens, critical infrastructure, our water supply system, things of that nature, that have remained operating uninterrupted. Certainly it's been a challenge from an operational standpoint, but we're not alone in sort of just that mission to continue on. Within the community development department, all of our operations have continued on, just in slightly different fashion. So, planning, the majority of staff that can, or all the staff that can telecommute and work from home, they are doing so to the fullest extent possible, and really have been since March. Our field staff, they continue to operate out in the field to the maximum extent possible. And you'll see them out there with, face masks and gloves, and still doing code enforcement operations, any of the field investigations. And our building and safety inspections are continuing on. There were times when we had partial stops on some of the types of services that we were providing because of that concern about going into, inhabited residences to perform inspections. But we're still continuing to provide that service to the safest extent possible that we can still provide those. One major change that we've had is, really a lot of our processing is all done now electronically. So, we're still conducting plan reviews. We're still accepting applications for, developments or entitlements, and all of that is really happening electronically through email. And then for building permits and inspections, all of that's happening electronically through our online permit counter. So, technology has been a big boost for us right now, since we are not able to be open to the public like we were. And really moving forward, just it not only in terms of how the planning counter and the building counter are going to operate moving forward, but really all city services. It's going to be different. We'll never really probably be able to go back to business as usual, the way things work. And so that's a sort of a cold reality that we're confronting now, that we see the world through this totally different, coronavirus lens. So, how we provide services is going to change, even when we're going to be able to, serve customers face to face. And so that's a lot of the discussions that we're having now. When we do get the opportunity to reopen, what that's going to look like, how our services are going to, permanently change, and how we do that. So, from the city standpoint, the city's been very, very active in trying to address various impacts. So, I mean, the impacts have just been incredible. They've been across the board. So you've seen what the federal government has done with the types of stimulus actions that they've taken, the type of, safety net provisions that they've introduced, locally within the state as well as within the county. And here locally, we've adopted, certain provisions. So, we've adopted some tenant protection from eviction here locally. We've provided some relief for folks that are, maybe some relief from, business tax, late penalties, shutoffs for utilities, for being late on utility bills, things of that nature, understanding that there's just a huge financial impact that's happening to the community right now. And, a big part of it is just making sure that there's awareness of, what's happening, and awareness of the resources that are out there. So, one of the first things that the city did on the business side was set up basically an email distribution to businesses throughout the city, where we could immediately push out information about, payroll protection program, all the different grant programs, all the different types of assistance programs that have been rolled out, the federal, state, and local levels, and pushing that information out, where folks can get information about signing up for, being able to provide senior meals for restaurants that are facing challenges right now. So it's really been widespread, just the amount of impacts and, the directions that the city has looked to try to either provide information, provide folks, information about the coronavirus, about assistance, about testing, you name it. So that's continuing forward. And as I mentioned again, operations are continuing, to the safest practical means possible. And the discussion right now is about, hopefully as we get closer to reopening, what that's going to look like. So I wanted to have that as just a starter for a discussion. The commission may have some questions about, what's happening. I know there's certainly been all kinds of, perceptions out there about, the dangers. And I mean, my gosh, like just the evolution of people's understanding of what this threat is and what the impacts are, have just gone, it's evolved just so dramatically over the last couple of weeks. So, at this point, I just want to open it up for any questions.
My only comment is I love the clear freeways.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
I can go to anywhere I want in 30 minutes, no problem. What a nice change.
Yeah.
Now, Tim, does it look like we're going to do anything like retaining work at home stuff?
It's a good question.
I think it's a good idea if we can do it.
Yeah, nothing's set in stone yet. What I'll say is, in the big picture, telecommuting has only is just skyrocketed in popularity over the last couple of years. And, any workplaces that had reservations about it, basically anywhere where it was practical, almost all employers have moved dramatically in that direction in the last 2 months. How much of that remains permanent moving forward? I think a pretty significant amount of that. I mean, that includes government.
Yeah,
So,
my daughter-in-law works for sheriff's department. She's a deputy, and she's been working at home the whole time. My daughter is an HR person for Paychecks, and she's been doing hers all on the phone. It just shows it's something we can do if we just make a little effort at it, and it keeps it free. If nothing else, just being able to get on the road and go somewhere without having to worry about traffic jam is a blessing to me.
I think there's a lot of that shared sentiment out there right now, despite how clear some of the roads got over the last 2 months. It could be a work-life quality issue to be able to work from home. Obviously, there are challenges and kinks, and being able to do Zoom meetings, for example, that was a learning curve for hundreds of millions of people over the last couple months. And here we are, we're having our first Zoom meeting, something that if you asked me in February if this was something I ever envisioned us doing, I probably would have told you, yeah, maybe in the year 2025, but lo and behold, here we are.
Yeah.
Well, and meetings like the church has done a lot of stuff on Facebook to include our Sunday service. And we just tune in on Facebook, and there it is. And we haven't done any Skype to speak of, but that's all another service. It's just there's so many avenues. We need to approach them, and if we can keep the quality of life issues up, what the heck, why not?
Sure.
Enough. I'll shut up.
I do show that someone did phone in, so I do have a caller on the phone. Is that you, Vice Chair Pacheco?
Yes, it is, Michelle.
Okay,
How you
and I
guys
have, good evening. I have you coming or joining us at 6:44 p.m. this afternoon, just for the record. So
Yeah,
whenever.
I've been trying to get on. I just on my iPad, it's telling me that I'm waiting for you to let me join, and it keeps knocking me off. I don't know why. That's why I went to my phone.
Oh, okay. Yeah, if at any time you want to try it again, I'll keep an eye out.
I'm still trying it.
Oh, because I don't see you that you're waiting.
Yeah,
So
hold on 1 second. It should. Okay, if you see it come on, it should be asking you to let me join.
okay. So don't let me stop you.
These are the kinks we want to work out, which is perfect. Just in terms of where we're at with the Planning Commission, I just want to touch base on a couple things. But I don't, as a rule, I don't want to pass. I don't want us to skip more than 1 month of a meeting without touching base, just so that we always stay connected. And it looks like, based on our forecast, that we will likely have a public hearing item next month for our June regular meeting. And public hearings are obviously take on another level of significance. So we definitely wanted to make sure we ironed out some of the kinks of this technology. And Commissioner Montez, we'll work on getting you connected as well as Vice Chair Pacheco. And so hopefully we'll have that well in place in advance of the June public hearing. And we are actually pioneers. So we're actually the first guinea pigs that are utilizing the Zoom conference that's getting broadcast live via YouTube. So even the city council meetings have not been doing that. They've been doing kind of a like a MacGyver public distribution, basically by broadcasting the Zoom conference through a smartphone onto Facebook Live. So this is brand new for the city. So hopefully it works. I think Michelle's probably watching the YouTube broadcast, and she looks like it's working.
Yeah.
I do have Julie watching from home, and she's telling me whether or not it's streaming and if there's any kinks. So
Perfect. Thank you, Julie. Appreciate it. Yeah. Were there any other questions from any of the commissioners just on what's happening in terms of city action on coronavirus?
Well, it was hard to get any kind of numbers. I tried to call Sylvia just because I wanted to know what the city, and I didn't care about the city like I cared. I wasn't worried about the city council and the city offices. I wanted to see what we had in the entire 26,000 population. And I finally started getting some of it on the newspapers because I wanted to see what it was, how it was affecting us. And I understand it's because of the zip code problems here in town that it's hard to track the actual numbers.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll share just some, I guess, some broader numbers, but you know, throughout really what you consider the San Fernando Valley, the hit has been pretty hard. So as of last week, it was reported about 36, almost 3,700 documented cases, and this was as of April 27th. So this is a little bit outdated information, but the valley's been hit pretty significantly as a region. You know, in the San Fernando area, yeah, my understanding is that the numbers that get reported, which are not insignificant here in San Fernando, I think the last number I saw was at least 90 plus cases. And that was last week. So we may be somewhere closer to 100 cases thus far. My understanding is that number that's being reported through the county is attributable to the 91340 zip code. So that's a slightly larger geographic area than just city of San Fernando proper.
But at least we're finding out some of the things we can work them out now. I'm kind of a information freak. I want to know what the hell's going on, and I get a little crazy when I don't find it.
Yeah, and I want to preface any of these numbers. I mean, these numbers, you know, I don't want anyone to have a sense of false comfort if they perceive that the numbers are low. And I don't want to alarm folks if they see the numbers are, you know, dramatically high.
Right.
So, you know, on both ends, one, you know, in terms of low, really, you know, these numbers only reflect folks that have been tested,
right,
and that, you know, tested positive, you know, were you know, had the virus at the point where they could test positive on, you know, a test at the time that they took it. What that means is, you know, you may get exposed, and if you take that test 2 hours later, you may test negative. Because it hasn't gotten to that. You know, at the same time, you know, you may have, there are certain, I don't think the scientific community, there's any dispute that there are people earlier on in, you know, when it arrived here in the United States, that folks contracted the coronavirus, and, you know, through a scarcity of testing, had it passed, and, you know, whether or not they got tested after or not and test negative, you know, ultimately they were an earlier case that basically just never went identified. Yeah. You know, on the other end, you know, if you're alarmed at the large numbers, you know, what I would say is, you know, take that with, you know, the full context, which is, you know, it's still to this point, you know, well over 98% of folks that, you know, are testing positive, you know, they're surviving the you know, the coronavirus. So
we don't say that enough. We need to say that positive.
Yeah, yeah, and I never want to I don't want to underplay just how severe it is for people that do get seriously ill. You know, it's important to understand, you know, the whole ramification.
Awesome.
And Councilmember Pacheco, I see you. Oh, it looks like you just froze, but it's good to see you on the video feed.
I'm still here on the phone, so I don't know if the video is working or not. But
We can hear you, Vice Chair. Thanks.
Yeah.
Unless there is any other discussion on this, we can move on to the next item.
Sounds good.
All right. So the next item is, and thank you for all the commissioners. We had this scheduled back in the March meeting to go through part 3 of the 3-part APA Learn Planning Commission training series. And this is probably what I would consider probably the most interesting one, which is the one that has to do with planning law and ethics. So just as a refresher, this was a series that was put together by the American Planning Association. I'm going to share this and we'll be able to run this for you. But essentially what you're going to see is 2 gentlemen speaking, and they're going to be talking about legal decision making for planning commissioners. So the first gentleman, who's really the moderator, his name is Michael Blue, and he's a certified planner, and he's been a community development director for close to 20 years now, actively involved in the planning association. And you're going to have a gentleman, Greg Jones, who is an associate at Ansel Klink, where he's represented several communities, primarily in the Chicago community. What's always interesting about urban planning, and it's so cool to see these other jurisdictions, because it could be different area code, same exact issues. It's almost like mirror images, and these could be communities that are a world apart from here. So we're never alone in sort of the things that the issues that get raised, the conflicts that get experienced between applicants and neighbors and things of that nature, or the different type of ethical questions that you as commissioners have to face when dealing with these projects. So with that, I will get this running, and so I'm going to share my screen. So give me a second.
I apologize for that, guys. I'm having internet issues here, apparently.
Yep, there it comes.
All right. Now, can everyone see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. And we're going to get
Everyone is connected. Unbelievable.
And if you could, I'd ask everyone to, for the duration of the video, to mute, to switch to mute. And if you have any questions, or if you need to ask a question, you can either click raise your hand or send something through the chat, just so that everybody's able to hear the video.
Right.
All right. And if you can't hear the audio, please shout.
Here with Greg Jones of the law firm of Ansel Klink, and we're going to talk about the legal aspects of decision making related to plan commissioners. So Greg, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
So let's start with just that. What are the legal implications of a plan commission recommendation? How cautious do they have to be? Do they need to pay attention to any legal precedent? Or start us off with that.
Sure. Well, at its heart, a plan commission is supposed to conduct a thorough public vetting of a development proposal or anything that comes before it, and make a recommendation to the city council or the village board, whichever municipality it may be. So the recommendation matters, and the conduct of the hearing matters, because in theory, the facts and testimony provided at the hearing will provide the basis for the plan commission's recommendation. Plan commission needs to allow as many people or interested parties to speak at the public hearing as possible, because you want to make sure you have a well-rounded, full body of evidence to make a recommendation on. And village boards and city councils tend to pay attention to plan commissioners. The mayor appoints a plan commissioner, and they're typically confirmed by the city council, so they've placed trust in them. There's an expectation that they will go ahead and do their job thoroughly and diligently. So the recommendation absolutely matters.
Okay, so, but for the commission, they don't have to worry too much about the city getting sued, if they're doing their job, if they're going through the process correctly, and ultimately there's an elected body behind them that's making the final decision.
That's right. The commission needs to stay focused on the standards for approval for the request in front of it. So what does that mean? That's, if there's a variance request, the zoning code will have specific standards that the plan commission should consider when determining whether to support or recommend denial of a variance.
We need a
standards
stronger
for special use. Planned unit developments typically have much longer standards because it's a more involved process. So as long as the plan commission views the testimony that's provided at the hearing through the lens of those standards to determine whether or not the applicant is meeting those standards, the city's pretty well protected from a lawsuit.
Well, one of the questions we get a lot from commissions and commissioners in the work we do is they're always worried about setting a precedent. So if we allow this variation or approve that special use, haven't we set a precedent that allows the next one to come through that maybe we don't like, we can't say no to it? Tell us a little bit about precedent.
There's a lot of misconception around the concept of setting a precedent. The short answer is if you approve a fence variance for Joe Jackson, you're not required to go ahead and approve the next fence variance that comes in for Sally Smith. Each request should be evaluated on its own merits, its own facts, and its own circumstances. So we'll take Joe Jackson's fence variance request. Say he comes in and asks to build an 8-foot fence in a zoning district where only 6-foot fences are allowed. Maybe that 8-foot fence is warranted because there's a drive-through on the property next door, or there's an alley next door, or there's a dog kennel next door. Now, when Sally Smith comes in, her house backs up to another residential property. So there's differences, factual differences between the two cases. So the way that a plan commission can really protect itself from arguments of, well, you approved Joe's variance, you have to approve Sally's variance, is to focus and drill down on the facts. If you focus on the facts and the testimony presented at the hearing, it should become apparent that there are differences between the two. Now, that's the legal answer. It's difficult to set a precedent by approving one variance. There's also the public perception or political angle as well. Now, the public is not necessarily going to understand the nuance between the two variance requests. And this also reemphasizes the importance of making sure you clearly state on the record why you're supporting the variance, what those facts are. That way when someone comes in later, you can say, yes, but you're not located next to a kennel or a drive-through or an alley that has a lot of traffic.
Okay, that's great. We talk a lot about findings of fact as part of the deliberation. First of all, what are they? And second of all, why are they important?
Findings of fact are, it's an analysis of the testimony and facts presented at the hearing. So it's all the reasons why, or in some cases why not, a proposal meets the zoning standards in the ordinance. It's important to note that the findings of fact need to be based only on the testimony provided at the hearing or the meeting. You're not supposed to take into account any outside factors that haven't been presented on the record. So they're important because it shows that the Plan Commission is doing its job and it's considering the appropriate legal factors when it makes its recommendation. So the Plan Commissioners, again, this is going to be a common theme that runs throughout our talk. They need to be familiar with the standards and they need to view all testimony that's provided at the hearing through those standards. And it's pretty common for commissioners to actually have the standards written down on the dais next to them, and that's part of having a quality staff report as well.
And in terms of those findings of fact, they ultimately become part of the record. They ultimately find their way to the elected body that's making the decision. Who writes them? Staff, secretary, chair of the commission, somebody randomly selected from the commission?
It varies, and a lot of it depends on the capacity of the municipality, both in terms of how much staff support they have and things of that nature. So there's three common approaches. First, it's a really good to have the applicant submit draft findings of fact with his application. The applicant, at the end of the day, is the one asking for approval. He's asking for relief. Have him make his case in writing. And that serves a couple of purposes. First, it'll provide the commission with a general idea of what findings of fact may be if they wanted to support the case. And two, it'll help get the applicant in the right mindset before the hearing, because it's basically his presentation or his argument written down, which is good. It'll make for a more fruitful hearing. It'll get him focused on those standards as well. Alternately, the commission can draft its own findings. That can happen during the meeting. We certainly work with clients that have worksheets, basically, that have here's standard number 1, and there's 5 or 6 lines below it, and the commission, after the public hearing is closed, still during an open meeting, will discuss what facts and what testimony presented at the hearing satisfy that factor, and they'll walk through all of them. And that's a little bit more intensive. It can make the meeting a bit longer, but on the other hand, it also helps show the public how the sausage is made, so to speak. You know, it's very transparent. It's very apparent what the commission is doing. There's no activity behind closed doors. Or alternately, if it's a community with more resources, you can have staff prepare findings, either draft findings prior to the hearing or findings based on the testimony after the hearing. So there's no one right way to do it. If you have staff, they're typically the professionals, the experts. It's great to rely on them. We certainly recognize that not every community has a professional planner on staff.
But those findings written around those standards, those are really kind of the heart of the evaluation or the testimony process, aren't they?
They absolutely are, and they'll be forwarded on to the City Council for their consideration prior to the vote. Certainly, if you end up in court, the findings made by the Plan Commission are a consideration. So it's important, and you should take time with them.
So you mentioned, we talked about that there are standards that these findings of fact address, and that sometimes there's more of them. They're generally similar, they're not the same in every community, but sometimes you can say there's a lot of them. For a planned unit development, there might be more of them. Does the application have to meet all of these standards, or just most of them?
The application needs to meet the standards. It's not 1 out of 3 or 2 out of 3. It's not more than not. It's clear that the application needs to address each standard. So that's part of the burden that applicants carry, and that's why they need to be carefully consider the application they're bringing forth and whether or not they can state a claim and substantiate support for that proposal.
Aren't some of those standards written where there's some room for interpretation? I mean, those standards are not, is the building 6 feet tall? The standards talk about there's adequate facilities or there's adequate capacity, and there may be something about impact or trend of development. Those might be kind of fuzzy things. Is that true? And what if you can make a case the other way?
Yeah, there's absolutely room for argument, and that's why we have attorneys. But they're not yes or no answers in many cases. It's a lot of analysis based on the facts and circumstances related to the property, which is what this is supposed to be about. It's a hearing about what's going on the property.
So with that in mind, what should a commissioner keep in mind to be sure that as they're either asking questions or making their comments or deliberating amongst themselves, what should the commissioners keep in mind so that they're making a good case, that they're helping form those findings of fact to all those standards?
Well, first, and this is probably one of the more difficult things for commissioners to do, is you need to be able to discern between relevant testimony and facts and what we'll call all the other noise. Some of it's obvious. Personal attacks obviously have no place at a public hearing. But there are a lot of other things that fall into a gray area where the commission, especially if it's not a particularly experienced one, may place a false emphasis on it. So an example of this, I participated in a hearing where there was a drugstore that wanted to move into a neighborhood. It was adjacent to a park, and it was predominantly a single-family residential area around there. There was a member of the public who stood up and testified, and she had, through the Freedom of Information Act, obtained copies of police reports for a drugstore located in a different community, not even the same drugstore. And she proceeded to read pages and pages, and this was years of police reports, talking about how children were going to be kidnapped out of the parking lot of this drugstore, and how rapists and pedophiles tended to frequent pharmacy parking lots. That's not relevant. That's totally irrelevant. And it's important for the Plan Commission to recognize that, and that also emphasizes the importance of having a chair that has a pretty strong handle on meeting conduct. Because in that case, she was gavelled quiet and said, listen, if you have testimony that relates to the factors that the Plan Commission is required to consider, please provide that, but recognize that what you're talking about right now is not necessarily relevant. So the best advice really is to be familiar with those standards and view the testimony through the lens of those.
You mentioned gaveling a resident who's making a comment. And in terms of taking testimony and how much testimony and cutting off testimony, is there a legal answer to the question of how much testimony is enough, how much is too much, when can you cut people off, should you cut people off?
Generally err on the side of providing more testimony. It's painful. It can make for some long nights. You're going to see your family less, but that's your job. The City Council has the ability to curtail public comment largely out of necessity. They're governing the entire municipality. The Plan Commission's purpose is different. They're there to take testimony. They're there to listen to a wide range of claims, some more relevant than others, some clearly irrelevant. They don't have to listen to those. But if there's a degree of relevancy in what is being presented, the Plan Commission's obligated to listen. And that serves the purpose of making sure they're doing a thorough job, evaluating each proposal and giving it the time that it deserves. And it also protects the community, the city, from lawsuits in the future, that someone's due process rights were cut off. Folks have a right to be heard. That's why we have public notice requirements. That's why we have open meetings. And that's kind of the bedrock principle of democratic government.
Okay, that's great. So that's just part of the process.
Yes.
In terms of the operations of a commission or a plan commission, I know a lot of them have got their own bylaws, their own set of rules and procedures. Is that a requirement? Do they have to have those? And if they don't, is it a good idea to have them?
It's a good idea to have them, and laws can vary, do vary, I should say, from state to state. The bylaws are important because it's really the playbook for how the Plan Commission is supposed to function. So it talks about membership, it talks about obligation to attend meetings, it talks about conduct of meetings. A variant of Robert's Rules of Order is commonly used by a lot of Plan Commissions, but you don't have to use Robert's Rules of Order wholesale. You can make changes. It's really a good idea because Robert's Rules of Order is really intended to govern deliberative bodies that are in constant session, and Plan Commissions aren't. They hold a meeting once or twice a month and they're done. So the bylaws establish the ground rules. They can establish limits within reason on public comment as well. So if the situation comes up where the Plan Commission needs to limit public comment, and there are bylaws that have been adopted by the community, that's a stronger legal position if you ever need to defend it.
It sounds to me like a lot of these rules, a lot of this structure really is ultimately to the benefit of the commission, so that if you have a bylaw rule that says, we're going to try and end the meeting by 11 o'clock, or we're not going to start a new case after a certain time, and that you've got to stick with these findings of fact and consider those, that this structure can really be very helpful to the staff and the commission in managing what can be an emotional situation.
That's exactly right. It's the rules of the road, and it establishes expectations. And to your comment about ending meetings at a certain time, we've all been in situations where we've sat through the small hours of the morning listening to deliberations for commissioners who have been on the dais for 5, 6, 7, 8 hours, and it's hard to make good decisions when you've been sitting up there and it's 2 o'clock in the morning.
From a legal perspective, you might not make the best decision.
I would agree with that.
So the way motions are made, a lot of times you see commissioners get a little bit hung up in how they do this. One of the key understandings, though, is that motions are always supposed to be made in the affirmative. Is that right? And tell us why.
Yeah, that's correct. And an example will help highlight why or how this can go wrong, because it can go very wrong. So imagine you've got a controversial land use proposal. Say it's a glue factory. It's loud, it's noisy, it smells, and they want to locate next to a park in the middle of a residential neighborhood. So basically the least consistent land use you can imagine, with children playing in the the property next door in the backyard. And at some point during the hearing, it's very apparent that everyone in the audience is opposed to this other than the applicant. And one of the commissioners is just fed up, and he, in a moment of passion says, you know what, I'm going to make a motion that we deny this proposal. So, and the motion seconded. So the motion on the floor is now a motion to deny. So it's in the negative. So the roll is called, and everyone starts voting. Those voting yes on that motion are voting to kill the proposal. Those voting no on that motion are voting to support it. Now, take a step back. Think about a referendum question, or anytime you step into the ballot box. It says, Michael, do you support a tax increase to pay for constructing a new village hall? Your yes vote means yes. In the circumstance of this plan commission that just stated a negative motion, your yes vote would mean no. So that's confusing, and it also confuses the folks in the audience who are sitting there watching an entire dais of people vote yes to kill a project. And this goes on. It's not just an immediate concern, because the meeting minutes, from a legal perspective, when something goes wrong and there is a lawsuit later, the minutes are very important. It's frequently the only copy of the record, what happened at the hearing. And the minutes can be very confusing when it says motion to deny, and it says who voted yes, and you've got yeses, and you've got no's. I've seen circumstances too where you've had a negative motion stated, and a commissioner has realized after the fact, either at that meeting or a subsequent meeting, saying, hey, I meant to vote the other way. So then you've got another procedural hurdle, and it not only confuses the plan commission, it makes the community look bad and disorganized in certain respects. You want to come across as looking professional. So all of this is easily dispatched by just stating motions in the positive. So even if you hate the glue factory, you make a motion to approve the glue factory and let everybody vote no.
All said. Okay. That glue factory, now let's take something that could get approved, may have some conditions placed on it as part of the approval. And what we see is that sometimes conditions are things that get talked about. So one of the commissioners might say, we need better landscaping over there. But that's not part of the motion. It's not part of the approval. It might be in the minutes. But ultimately, that notion of, hey, we need more landscaping, that's not really binding. It's only binding if it's done how?
If you want it to be binding, it needs to be in the motion.
Okay.
And it will only be binding if the village board adopts an ordinance that expressly includes that condition. So if you feel strongly as a commissioner about a specific item, whether it's landscaping or the color of the building or signage or what have you, your motion to approve the development should state, I make a motion to approve the development subject to Bob the builder painting his building purple. Otherwise, it's not legally enforceable. Otherwise, the public who attended the meeting and heard the commissioner speak about the purple building will likely think that the building's supposed to be purple, and will probably end up calling Village Hall when it ends up being painted yellow.
I think a lot of planners have been in a situation where a meeting had to be changed or rescheduled or a case removed because public notice was not properly made. So there are these legal terms that we hear a lot. We hear about public notice and open meetings, and they seem to just be very controlling in what goes on. Can you explain those concepts a little and why it really is important to pay attention to those?
Sure. This is the public process is quite possibly the most important component of the entire zoning review. Government's credibility is largely reliant on how responsive and accountable it is to the public. And the zoning process in Illinois and elsewhere requires open public hearings to be conducted for zoning proposals. This provides the public an opportunity to come out and express either their support or dissatisfaction with the proposal, and it allows a full record to be built. Without a public process, you get a lot of palace intrigue, frankly. Like there was a meeting behind closed doors, smoke-filled or not, and these decisions were made, and I didn't have an opportunity to speak, and that really contradicts what the basic principles of responsible government are. So in order to build credibility in government, in order to lend credibility to the decision that will ultimately be made by the city council, you need to have a big tent process where everyone's invited in and folks can come out and share their views about it.
So I want to turn a little bit to the legal elements of being a commissioner, things that the commissioners have to know. What kind of ethics rules are there that are binding on commissioners?
Well, the ethics rules, that's a good question. And the ethics rules vary from state to state, but there's some certain common elements that run throughout them. For example, Illinois has what's commonly known as the Gift Ban Act. And it, as the name implies, prohibits commissioners from accepting gifts from prohibited sources. Now, I'm not going to sit here and lecture you on the specifics of the law and all of the elements because we don't have time and you don't have patience. But a lot of this is common sense. So an example, if you're a commissioner and someone who is before the commission, whether it's a developer or your neighbor who wants to get a variance to reduce his side yard setback, offers to buy you a new car or something expensive or anything really significant, and that seems out of the ordinary, you should probably think about it. So there's a couple important things to know here. Acknowledge that there are laws that govern conduct for plan commissioners. The typical plan commissioner is not going to spend time digging through statute books to understand what each of those laws are, but just know they're out there and exercise some common sense. B, as a commissioner, you're not an island unto yourself. You have a support network. Typically, there's staff. Typically, there's an attorney. If you find yourself in a situation where you don't feel comfortable or something doesn't smell right, talk to staff. Talk to the attorney, and they'll provide you with counsel through it. It can be a little bit awkward in the moment when somebody offers you something and you say, hey, you know what, I really appreciate it, but I don't know if this is appropriate. I'm going to talk with staff. Let me get back to you. That's typically all it takes, and it can keep you out of trouble, and it can keep the community out of trouble too. Because what you really want to avoid is the specter of impropriety, because that can taint both the proceedings that are before the Plan Commission, whether it's a specific development proposal, and it can also implicate just the credibility of government in general. There's a lot of folks out there who think that government's on the take, and that's not the case in the vast majority of circumstances. But proceeding cautiously, understanding that there are laws that implicate your conduct, and realizing that you have resources that you can rely on will get you a long way.
Kind of related to that is the notion of a conflict of interest. So a lot of times you hear commissioners talk about, well, they have a conflict, or do they have a conflict, and sometimes they recuse themselves from a matter. So can you tell us what constitutes a conflict of interest and when somebody should recuse themselves?
Sure. The term conflict of interest gets bandied about, particularly in the public, more than it should. But there are situations where there are legitimate conflicts of interest, and commissioners should be aware of those situations. First, and an example will probably be most helpful here because the conflict statutes do vary from state to state. But take, for example, a plan commissioner who owns a property that's located next to a car dealer, luxury car dealer, big, beautiful cars. And the car dealer approaches the plan commissioner and says, hey, we're thinking about expanding our dealership. We're going to sell even more cars. This is great for the town, increased tax revenue. Everybody's going to be happy. We think you're going to love our beautiful dealership. There's glass windows and everything else. The commissioner says, yeah, that sounds great. So they enter into a purchase and sale agreement that's contingent on getting zoning approval. The developer then comes before the plan commission and asks for his rezoning in order to build his new dealership. The plan commissioner is sitting up on the dais. Does he have a conflict? It's a pretty obvious example. That absolutely is a conflict of interest. He has a contractual interest in the property that is part of the development proposal. So it's not okay for him to cast a vote on that. That undermines his ability to think in the public interest and keep the public interest and those zoning factors in mind. Because no matter how hard he tries, he's going to have that dollar value stuck in the back of his head that he wants to get for selling property. That's a clear conflict of interest. Those situations, if they do come up, 9 times out of 10, probably more than 9 times out of 10, that commissioner is going to recuse himself. Those are pretty obvious. There are other situations which fall into more of a gray area. So same example, but say there's no zoning contingency involved in the contract. Say the luxury dealer just buys the property outright and then comes back for approval a year or 18 months later. And that proposal comes before the plan commission, and that commissioner, who 18 months ago sold the property to the car dealer, sitting up there. There's an open question as to whether or not it's okay for him to vote on it. In a lot of states, it's okay. There's not a contractual interest, so there's not a clear conflict of interest. That's the legal answer and the legal analysis based on the statute. But as a commissioner, you also have to keep in mind the optics and the appearance of impropriety. How would it look if a resident or the paper found out that that commissioner sold the property and then during the meeting was a vocal advocate for the development, and it ultimately went through and got approved? So there's a public perception component of it too. And just because there's not a legal conflict of interest, it's a good idea for commissioners to keep the public perception in mind. And if you think there's an issue, you can always recuse yourself. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that.
What about, there are times where people might think there's a conflict of interest, but there really isn't. So if the church you're part of is coming for a special use before you, or your country club comes before the commission, or if there's a rezoning for an entire zoning district in the downtown and you happen to own a property in the downtown, you're connected to it, but are those necessarily a conflict of interest?
Not necessarily. You really have to take a closer look. And this is where the public and sometimes the media that's reporting on it can get it wrong. You end up with sensationalized headlines of commissioner on the take, he's voting for his own self-interest. You really need to look at the specific facts and circumstances. Like an example that comes up frequently, say Apple. Everybody loves Apple. An Apple store is coming to town, and Michael, you're a commissioner and you own Apple stock. And you know what? You voted to support that Apple store. That's not necessarily a conflict. Now, if you own 10% of Apple's stock, that probably would be a conflict because that's. I'm sorry to hear that. That would be pretty close to a controlling interest. But most people don't own 10% of Apple's stock. They own some shares and they have it set aside for retirement or what have you. So the facts are important and the analysis is important. And it never hurts too in these situations to state on the record, listen, I'm a parishioner of this church. But I'm not involved in the business management or affairs of this church, and I feel comfortable voting on it. And you might catch some flack from some people, the public, but a lot of them are going to appreciate that you've been upfront and you've explained your relationship and explained that there's no more palace intrigue going on here.
And I'll go back to the advice you gave with the last question we had about ethics, is if there's a question about a conflict of interest, contact your staff, contact your corporation counsel.
Always, always, and that's another really good point. I know a lot of communities don't have corporation counsel at the meetings, but they certainly can help, and this is one of the situations they can. There are legal issues that will come up that will inevitably be outside of the chairman or the commission's comfort zone, and having legal counsel there can really help you navigate those waters in the most sensitive of situation, a meeting that's televised or in front of a bunch of your neighbors and friends.
So one more thing about the commissioners that's got to be important because I think it's Latin. This idea of ex parte communication or talking to people outside of the meeting. Why is that an issue and what should be avoided there?
The whole purpose of the Plan Commission and the public meeting process is to have these deliberations in the public. There's nothing to hide here. Everything's up front. The decision, the recommendation that the Plan Commission makes is based only on the testimony and evidence presented at the hearing. So there's no hide the ball. Everything that you need to see is in front of you. Ex parte communications are when an applicant or an interested party lobbies a Plan Commissioner or City Councilman behind the scenes. So they invite you out for dinner. They show up at your door and say, "Hey, I bought you a cup of coffee. Let's sit down and talk." Now, this is going to happen. You're a public official. A lot of these meetings are televised on TV in some communities. People are going to understand that you're serving your community, and that's a great thing. But as a result of them being aware of your service, they're going to go to you if they think there's an issue that you can help with. You're not going to go run and hide in the bushes. Or if you see Joe, your neighbor, coming down the street, you don't run across the street to avoid him. It's not realistic. But the best advice is you want to keep all of these discussions in the public. So if someone comes up to you and says, "Hey, I really want to talk to you about this development proposal," you say, "Thanks, I really appreciate it, but as a Plan Commissioner, we're supposed to hold these hearings. Please come to the hearing. We'd love to hear what you have to say. That's the best way to make a difference, and your input really matters."
If you can't make it, send a letter perhaps or an email
Absolutely.
to staff.
Yeah, absolutely. And staff you bring up another good point with staff. come to the meeting, or you can also direct folks to staff. Say, hey, if you have input about the proposal, staff's really managing this. They're doing the whole, the public input prior to the meeting. So call Sally the planner, or send an email to this email address and give them your thoughts. Those thoughts will be shared with the commission. Those thoughts will be shared with the city council. Your voice will be heard. It just provides structure around the communication process, and it also provides a barrier protecting the commission from allegations that there's something nefarious going on.
Goes back to what you said before about the optics. It doesn't look like there's something going on. Everything's out front.
Yeah, exactly. And one last thought on this too. If you do happen to have a conversation with someone, and say it's a friend, and these conversations can happen. You start on one topic and you shift to another, and he brings up a relevant point about a development proposal that's before the commission. Disclose it during the public hearing. Say, hey, you know what? On Sunday, I had Joe over. We were watching the Bears game, and he brought up a point on this that I think is relevant, and I want to share it with the public. It tells them that the conversation happened. It puts it on the record. It shows that there's nothing to hide. So there are options to deal with it other than finding a bush to jump into.
And I think that's great advice, because I think a lot of times commissioners are uncomfortable with this idea of disclosure, letting people know what happened. But as we used to warn people, you don't want Joe to come and stand at the podium and go, hey, when I was talking to Commissioner Gregg about this the other, he thought it was a fine idea. So it really, again, it's another one of these ways that the structure of the system really helps the commissioner, protects the commissioners, they do their job.
That's exactly right. It's being called out at a public hearing for a private conversation is definitely a red-faced moment.
Absolutely. All right, well, Greg, thank you for sharing your insights on the legal aspects of the commission function, and we thank you for your time.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I hope that was interesting and thought-provoking.
Pretty good, actually.
It brought up one thing, Tim, that we didn't talk about in our bylaws, is the no new items after so long. I like that idea.
No new items after, I'm sorry?
Like 10 o'clock or whatever.
Oh,
So we didn't specify that in our stuff.
I hope that never happens.
yeah, I don't think we've, at least during my time here, that thankfully has not been an issue. And if it ever becomes one,
We will close it.
Yeah.
We'll cut it. We'll cut it.
Absolutely.
and we have a couple comments here from our corporate counsel, the term that they use. But I just want to open it up for Richard if he wanted to provide some color commentary or to provide some local context from our specific rules here.
Thank you, Tim. Yes, certainly an excellent presentation provided by Tim. I did notice that he was speaking in very general terms in terms of different jurisdictions. So I think there was a level of specificity that perhaps was beyond the scope of that presentation. And my only point on that is for you to be aware that California has its own very specific sets of laws, many of which kind of parallel principles and concepts that he talked about, but are very important for you to be aware of. One of the things I think I want to stress the most in terms of asking questions about whether you have a conflict of interest or not is to try to bring that to certainly to the extent that you want to reach out to me, to our attention as early as you reasonably can when you find out. I have to be honest with you that 90% of the time when I get asked by somebody, do I have a conflict of interest, it's usually like about a half hour before the meeting starts with very limited information about what their specific economic circumstances are. And with that very little notice and that very little opportunity to really evaluate what your particular circumstances are, the only really safe answer I can give you is to recuse yourself in an abundance of caution. And sometimes that's okay, but sometimes it's a little bit of a disappointment because there may be something that you legitimately wanted to participate on and you probably should have participated on, if adequate time had been given to really dig in the weeds on that. Beyond that, what I want to also stress is that, and this is not a cop-out on my part, while I can certainly give you my take on whether or not you have a conflict of interest, my take on that and your reliance on my take on that, unfortunately, does not provide you with a legal defense if someone were to try to prosecute you for violating the conflict of interest laws. That's not my way of discouraging you from reaching out to me. I think you absolutely should. But what I do want to stress to you is that the one way you can get a get out of jail free card, unfortunately, this again requires a little bit of planning ahead, is that you can write to the California Fair Political Practices Commission. They are the watchdog for conflicts of interest in the state of California. And they, based on the facts you provide them, can give you an opinion letter as to whether or not you have a conflict on a particular matter. And the value of that opinion letter is that even if a court were to later on disagree with the FPPC about the application of the law, you would be immune from prosecution because you relied on an FPPC opinion letter. Your FPPC opinion letter is gold. The challenge is that they don't give these letters out overnight. You do need to kind of give them at least a 1 to 2 month lead time. So I think to the extent that you can reasonably foresee certain projects coming forward, it's incumbent upon you to reach out to me, reach out to the FPPC as early as you can so that you can probably avail yourself of that FPPC letter. One final point I just wanted to make having to do with how you evaluate the information that comes before you. The term I always like to throw out is that you guys are operating in what's called a quasi-judicial capacity. You are acting not as makers of law, but as people who are there to apply law that has been created either by the state of California or in most instances by your city council. So when you are evaluating a project, it is critically important that you evaluate in accordance with the criteria that's established either under the Municipal Code or under state law. And I think the attorney in the video kind of touched on that. You are not permitted to add criteria that is beyond the scope of a particular approval. No matter how much distaste you may have for approval, that's actually suicide for you to do that, because that very act would actually, if your aim was to undermine the approval, that very act would actually benefit an applicant who later wanted to challenge a denial. So it's critically important that you apply the criteria, that you apply it even-handedly. There's no such thing as the attorney said about creating precedents. Each project has to be evaluated on its own merits, but it has to be evaluated under the same principles, or under the same criteria. So in that respect, when you do have different applicants for essentially the same approval, it is important that you measure the merit of that approval by pre-established criteria, not by personal feelings you may have about the type of project that's being proposed, or in the worst case scenario, by your particular opinions about an applicant. So I think that's all I really wanted to add, and I'm happy to answer any other questions if you have any at this time.
Any other questions from the commission?
I'm good.
I'm good
No
too.
questions.
That's a good
Okay.
presentation.
Yeah,
That's
good.
on the same quality as the first two we had. I thought it was well done.
Yeah, very
Great,
good.
great. I'm glad it was not only entertaining enough to sit through, that it was thought provoking too.
Agreed.
Okay, so with that, are we then down to staff communications or Tim?
Yes. And Chair Durham, I do have a couple items of staff communications that I'll walk through quickly. Really just 3 items. First one is back at our last meeting in March. We walked through basically our first ever, and the video actually alluded to this, our commission's first ever set of bylaws and rules of procedures. And so there were some edits that were recommended. We didn't want to risk taking any official actions tonight in case, all the technology broke. but it also gives us an opportunity to have the full commission here to talk about it. What we'll do is we can agendize this for a future meeting, perhaps as soon as June, and walk through the latest version of the bylaws, integrating the comments from the commissioners from March. One of the items that our legal counsel suggested during that March discussion was about what we would use as sort of a foundational basis for our rules. And it was suggested that there's actually an alternate version of rules of order that's actually much more contemporary, a lot shorter, and really it's Robert's Rules of Orders, but for the 21st century, and more geared towards commissions like ours, which meet infrequently, versus rules that were in place for several hundred years ago for sort of standing parliament. And so that's called Rosenberg's Rules of Orders. It was new to me, but I did take a look at it. And what I'd like to do is we'll distribute a copy of Rosenberg's Rules of Orders out to the commissioners. And it's actually a very quick read. And I think it's actually quite excellent in putting into normal, human being language that you can understand. And it's a very brief document. I want to say it's less than 10 pages that you can walk through. And it all just makes all the different procedures and rules make a lot more sense. So I would recommend that the commission consider using that as a guide to conduct the meetings of the commission, rather than the parliamentary procedure, the classic Robert's Rules of Orders. I think you'll find that it's a lot more easily understandable.
Yeah, this is Robert's Rules of Order, which is about 600 pages of very hard to read text. So unless you're running the British Parliament in the 1800s, or perhaps even Congress, this is not a very good fit for 5-member committees. And I should tell you that Rosenberg's rules that is referenced by Tim is actually saying, is actually promoted by the California League of Cities. So it's not something we just found in some, obscure corner of the internet. This is actually something well recognized by California city governments as a preferred method for managing meetings.
And I actually oversold it. It's a full 7 pages. So you can easily digest this and read it. And on Richard's point, anybody that told you that they've read all of Robert's Rules of Orders is either an attorney or grossly exaggerating.
He's a liar. He's a liar.
I ain't reading this thing all cover to cover. So.
I've been in charge of thousands of meetings, and I haven't read more than probably 10 pages of Robert's Rules.
Right, exactly. So second item for you is just a reminder that your Form 700 is due. And I think that there are a couple of commissioners, and apologies for naming you, but I think Commissioner Montez.
I'm one of them.
I just special enough.
And Commissioner and Vice Chair Pacheco. So yours are due if you can. If you need any tips on where to go and who to contact, we're a resource, and the city clerk is as well. So the deadline, you're in luck. However, the deadline, because of the current situation with the pandemic, was extended. So the deadline is now June 1st. So you're saved by the bell. But that's coming up very soon. So I highly recommend getting that done as soon as possible. And then the third one is wonderful news. The city of San Fernando was nominated for an American Planning Association award for the Los Angeles section. We were nominated in the comprehensive plan category for a small jurisdiction for our San Fernando corridor specific plan. For short, we call it SB5.
SB5, yeah.
Yeah, so if you'll recall, back in 2018, right after the plan went into effect, we won the SCAG award. So the regional planning organization, we won their award. And if we win this award through APA Los Angeles, that's really sort of the combo of, you know, the highest planning awards you can receive for an agency. So my understanding is that there will be an announcement within probably the next week and a half. And look out for that. If it's announced, I will be sure to let you all know the good news.
Great.
Typically in a normal year, and we're not in a normal year, American Planning Association LA section, they hold basically an awards gala that would occur in June. And, you know, you wear your finest and, you know, you get honored at a large banquet, essentially. That obviously cannot happen next month. And my understanding is that they'll either have to pass on that this year, just because, you know, large gatherings, we have no idea when those will be able to occur again, or they'll be shooting for something in the wintertime, most likely November or December, if we're able to do something of that nature. So if that happens, I'll be sure to let everybody know. And if we do get an award, we'll probably look at getting some seats at that gala so we can celebrate that.
You got my dress blues and tennis shoes.
Yeah, there you go. That concludes staff communication. Thank you, Chair.
Any comments from the folks listening in? My commissioner friends here?
No comment.
Nope. I think this is a good trial time because we had the latitude to make mistakes and fix them up. I think it was good.
Yeah, I think thanks to you, this was good.
Okay. If there's nothing else, Tim, are we ready for an adjournment?
We'll take a motion to adjourn.
Yeah. Somebody want to make a motion to adjourn?
Yes, I'll make a motion.
Ida wants to go home.
He's already home.
No, she's
I
in my
second that motion.
Okay, so Ida and Ivan, all those approved, all those in favor? Oh, never mind. I'm sorry. Michelle, you got to do a roll call. All right.
Oh, you're on mute, Michelle.
Commissioner Ida Montes, you move to adjourn to the June 8th, 2020 regularly scheduled meeting date. Is that correct?
Yes, I do.
Commissioner Ivan Gonzalez, you second?
That is correct.
And Vice Chair Pacheco, your vote?
He's on mute.
He's deaf.
He's on mute, Paul. You're right. You're right.
Are you on mute? Hold on.
I guess, I
Go
don't know.
Go ahead.
There you go.
We hear you now. Your vote?
Okay, yes,
Yes.
yes.
Okay, Commissioner Perez, your vote?
Yes.
And Chairperson Alvin Durham, your vote?
Absolutely, yes.
All right, so the meeting is adjourned at 7:52 p.m. to the June 8th, 2020 meeting.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Please say good night to Richard's cat, who of course stole the show yet again.
Well, I'm just grateful. My
Michelle, I
wife
have a
says,
question for you.